Greetings, fellow seekers of truth and quiet understanding. Settle in, perhaps with a warm drink, as we journey back to an age when the tides of power shifted with every galley on the waves. Today, we peel back the layers of a forgotten conflict, a desperate alliance against a rising storm in the shimmering heart of the Aegean Sea. If this journey resonates with you, do consider leaving a like, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and perhaps passing this tale on to another curious mind. Let the whispers of the past begin. The gentle lapping of waves against a distant shore, the creak of timber under a salt-laden breeze, the hushed murmur of an ancient sea carrying whispers of impending storm. Close your eyes and imagine the Aegean in the early 14th century, a glittering sapphire sea, but one increasingly stained by the dark sails of a relentless foe. This isn't a story of grand empires clashing, but of a desperate, almost reluctant alliance forged in the crucible of fear and necessity. This is the tale of the First Holy League, a testament to the fact that even the most disparate powers can be drawn together when a common shadow falls over their collective doorstep. For centuries, the Mediterranean had been a highway of commerce, a crucible of culture, and often a battlefield. But by the dawn of the 14th century, a new and escalating threat was reshaping the very fabric of life along its eastern shores. From the heartland of Anatolia, a new power was stirring: the Turkish Beyliks. These weren't unified empires, but rather fragmented, dynamic principalities, each with ambitions, each with a burgeoning naval prowess that was quickly turning the azure waters of the Aegean into a hunting ground. Their ships, swift and predatory, were not merely raiding for plunder. They were systematically disrupting the very arteries of trade that sustained the Latin Christian states in the region. Now, among these Christian states, one stood out as the undisputed maritime titan, the Republic of Venice. Her very existence, her wealth, her influence were woven into the vast tapestry of her overseas commerce. From the bustling markets of Constantinople to the spice routes of the Levant, Venetian galleys plied the waves, laden with goods and gold. But as the Turkish raids intensified, as their ships grew bolder, the once predictable rhythm of trade was replaced by an unsettling uncertainty. Imagine the anxiety gripping a Venetian merchant, his fortune invested in a fleet sailing east, knowing that at any moment the ominous silhouette of a Turkish ship could appear on the horizon, turning his venture into ruin. For Venice, this wasn't just a nuisance. It was an existential threat, a slow strangulation of her economic lifeblood. But Venice, powerful as she was, couldn't face this growing menace alone. The Aegean was a vast and complex mosaic of territories, each with its own interests, its own vulnerabilities. There were the Knights Hospitaller, those formidable warrior monks who, having been driven from the Holy Land, now held Rhodes, a crucial strategic outpost. There was the beleaguered Byzantine Empire, a shadow of its former glory, clinging to remnants of its past power, its once mighty navy a mere whisper of what it once was. And then there was the Kingdom of Cyprus, an island stronghold, itself a target for these increasingly audacious raids. The problem, you see, was that no single Latin ruler in the region possessed the naval strength to effectively dominate the Aegean and consistently push back against the Turks. It was a situation ripe for fragmentation, for each entity to fend for itself, leaving them vulnerable to being picked off one by one. And indeed, for a time, that was largely the reality. There were bilateral agreements, temporary alliances, born of immediate necessity rather than long-term strategy. Consider, for instance, a fleeting treaty struck between the Genoese, Venice's arch-rivals in trade, and the Hospitallers before 1319. They pooled their resources, equipped a combined fleet, and in the summer of that year, achieved a significant victory, crushing a fleet belonging to the Aedenids, one of the more aggressive Turkish Beyliks. This victory, though localized, sent ripples throughout the West. News of it reached the ears of Pope John XXI, a pontiff keenly aware of the encroaching threat to Christendom. For him, and for the crusade theorists who advised him, such a victory offered a tantalizing glimpse of what a truly unified naval league could achieve. They envisioned a powerful Christian fleet that could not only enforce an economic blockade against the Turks, cutting off their resources and strangling their growing maritime power, but also actively check their advances in the Aegean. This wasn't just about defense. It was about reclaiming the initiative, about pushing back the tide. Meanwhile, a different kind of pressure was being exerted closer to home, within the very heart of the Venetian Republic. The notorious Catalan Company, those formidable and often ruthless mercenaries, were active in Greece, their presence creating a complex web of political and economic challenges. In response to this broader instability and recognizing the danger of inadvertently strengthening their enemies, Venice took a drastic step. Under heavy penalties, they explicitly banned all Venetian merchants from trading with the Turks. Imagine the economic implications of such a decree, the disruption to established trade routes, the outcry from merchants who saw their livelihoods threatened. But the Venetians understood the gravity of the situation. Every bolt of cloth, every measure of grain traded with the Turks was indirectly funding the very raids that threatened their shipping. So, with the twin pressures of direct Turkish aggression and the shifting political landscape, Venice began to explore the possibility of a more formalized, enduring alliance. They dispatched emissaries, skilled diplomats, to the key players in the region. They approached the Byzantine emperor, Andronicos II, a man whose empire, though diminished, still held symbolic weight and strategic outposts. They also sought out Martino Zaccaria, the powerful lord of Chios, an independent-minded Genoese nobleman who controlled a crucial island stronghold. And, of course, they approached Elion de Villeneuve, the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, whose order commanded a formidable fighting force and controlled Rhodes, an invaluable base of operations. The Venetian proposition was clear: to inquire about the possibility of forming a societas, a true partnership for the mutual protection of their lands against the relentless Turkish incursions. The diplomatic wheels, slow and deliberate, began to turn. After much negotiation, much weighing of individual interests against the collective threat, a significant breakthrough occurred. On September 6, 1332, representatives from Venice, the Byzantine Empire, and the Knights Hospitaller formally entered into an alliance. It was designed to last for 5 years, a testament to its tentative nature, but a crucial first step nonetheless. The agreement was ambitious: to assemble a formidable fleet of 20 fully equipped galleys to be gathered in the bustling harbor of Negropont, a Venetian stronghold, by April 15, 1333. However, as is so often the case in the labyrinthine world of medieval politics, the best-laid plans rarely unfolded without a hitch. The agreed-upon date for the fleet's assembly came and went without a single galley from the promised 20. Venetian attention, so recently focused on the Aegean, had been abruptly diverted by a sudden and urgent revolt on Crete, one of their most important overseas possessions. Such was the volatile nature of the age. A crisis in one corner of their empire could derail even the most pressing international commitments. Yet, despite this initial setback, the momentum for a unified response was growing. Later that same year, the weight of higher authority was brought to bear. Pope John XXI, ever the architect of Christian unity against external threats, through his considerable influence behind the nascent league. Crucially, he secured the support of the kings of France and Cyprus, adding formidable political and potentially financial backing to the alliance. By early 1334, the commitment had deepened, and the participants agreed on an even more ambitious target: a grand total of 40 galleys. This was a statement, a clear signal that the Christian powers of the Aegean were finally ready to stand together. The Pope, demonstrating his commitment, initiated the construction of 4 powerful galleys in Marseille in March of that year. These ships, each boasting an impressive 176 to 180 oars, were a significant investment a tangible manifestation of papal resolve. To command this Franco-papal fleet, Pope John XXII appointed a distinguished French knight, John of Sepoy, a figure who would become instrumental in the League's early operations. So the stage was set. The storm had been brewing for years, the individual gusts of Turkish raids growing into a relentless wind. Now, the Christian powers of the Aegean, initially fragmented and vulnerable, were beginning to coalesce. The idea of a Holy League, once a theoretical concept debated in papal courts, was on the cusp of becoming a tangible, powerful force. But would this fragile alliance, born of necessity and fraught with internal politics, be strong enough to weather the storm, or would it, like so many noble endeavors, crumble under the weight of its own disparate ambitions? The answer lay in the turbulent waters of the Aegean, where the fate of trade, territory, and faith hung precariously in the balance. The shadows of Turkish galleys grew long and menacing across the sun-drenched waters of the Aegean. For generations, the fragmented Christian powers of the Eastern Mediterranean had danced a perilous jig with these burgeoning naval forces, often striking temporary, fragile truces or engaging in isolated skirmishes. But the tide was turning. The Turkish Beyliks of Anatolia, particularly the Aydinids, Karasi, and Sarukin, were not merely raiders. They were becoming a formidable presence, eroding the very foundations of Christian maritime trade and security. This wasn't just about lost ships or plundered cargo. For the Republic of Venice, whose very lifeblood pulsed through its vast network of overseas commerce, these raids were an existential threat. Imagine the meticulous accounting of a Venetian merchant, every ducat, every ounce of spice, every bolt of silk painstakingly tallied, only to have it all vanish into the smoke of a Turkish longship on the horizon. The economic engine of the Republic, indeed much of Latin Europe, was under siege. It was this creeping dread, this shared vulnerability, that began to knit together disparate interests. The idea of a unified front, a societas as they called it, wasn't born in a sudden flash of diplomatic genius, but rather from the grim realization that no single power, no matter how influential, could stem this rising tide alone. The Aegean was too vast, the Turkish threat too widespread. Consider, for a moment, the landscape of the early 14th century. We're talking about a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, each with its own intricate web of alliances and rivalries. The Byzantine Empire, a shadow of its former self, still held sway over pockets of territory, but its imperial ambitions were often overshadowed by internal strife and external pressures. The Knights Hospitaller, those formidable warrior monks, held Rhodes, a crucial bastion, but their resources, though significant, were not limitless. And then there was Cyprus, a Latin kingdom, always looking over its shoulder, caught between East and West. Early, ad hoc successes provided a glimpse of what could be. Before 1319, the Genoese and the Hospitallers, two often contentious powers, managed to put aside their differences for long enough to equip a joint fleet. That summer, they inflicted a crushing defeat upon an Aedenid fleet. News of this victory, like a ripple in a stagnant pond, spread westward, eventually catching the ear of Pope John XXII. Now, Pope John XXII was no stranger to grand schemes. The papacy, even from Avignon, held immense moral authority and, critically, considerable financial resources. For crusade theorists of the time, this victory in the Aegean sparked a renewed fervor. Here, they argued, was not just a defensive measure, but a potential springboard for a new crusade, a way to both enforce a much-needed economic blockade against the Turks and to halt their relentless advance into Christian lands. Meanwhile, economic pressures were building elsewhere. The notorious Catalan Company, those formidable and often ruthless mercenaries, were making their presence felt in Greece, disrupting trade and sowing chaos. This pushed Venice to take a drastic but necessary step, a ban, under the harshest penalties, on all Venetian merchants trading with the Turks. This was a clear signal, a statement that the time for profitable, albeit risky, coexistence was over. The enemy was defined, and commerce that strengthened them was no longer tolerable. It was in this atmosphere that Venice, ever the pragmatist, dispatched emissaries. They sailed to Constantinople to consult with the Byzantine Emperor Andronicos II, then to Chios to meet Martino Zaccaria, the lord of that strategically vital island, and finally to Rhodes, the stronghold of Elion de Villeneuve, the Grand Master of the Hospitallers. The message was clear: a proposition for a sustained societas, a formal alliance for mutual protection against the common foe. On September 6, 1332, the long-held hope of a unified front began to solidify. Representatives from Venice, Byzantium, and the Knights Hospitaller formally entered into an alliance. The terms were ambitious: a commitment to assemble a formidable fleet of 20 fully equipped galleys, to be moored and ready for action in the harbor of Negropont by April 15, 1333. A 5-year pact, a commitment to enduring cooperation. But, as with so many grand plans in history, the path from parchment to reality was anything but smooth. The agreed-upon date of April 15, 1333, came and went with no assembled fleet. Venetian attention, ever fluid and pragmatic, had been momentarily diverted by an unexpected and troublesome revolt on their valuable island of Crete. Internal challenges, it seems, often have a way of delaying even the most critical external endeavors. Yet the idea, the necessity persisted. Later that same year, the momentum reignited. Pope John XXII, with his vision of a broader Christian endeavor, threw his considerable weight behind the alliance. Crucially, he secured commitments from the kings of France and Cyprus. The roster of participants was growing, and with it, the potential for true strength. By early 1334, the negotiations bore fruit. The participants reached a new agreement, a truly impressive commitment, a total fleet of 40 galleys. This was not a small undertaking. To put it in perspective, 4 of these galleys, each boasting between 176 and 180 oars, were constructed in Marseille, entirely at the Pope's expense. To lead this Franco-Papal contingent, Pope John XXII appointed the French knight John of Sepoy, a testament to the international scope and serious intent of this burgeoning Holy League. And so, in the summer of 1334, the disparate threads began to weave together. The Franco-Papal fleet, a powerful statement of Western European commitment, joined forces with the ships of the Venetians, the Hospitallers, and the Cypriots. The sight of these assembled vessels, sails unfurled, pennants snapping in a breeze, must have been a truly awe-inspiring spectacle. The Byzantine galleys, though part of the original agreement, were notably absent, highlighting the ongoing complexities and often strained relationships within the alliance. But despite this absence, the fleet was at full strength, a unified Christian armada poised to strike. Their target was clear: the Turkish Beyliks of Aegean, Karasi, and Sarukin, the primary architects of the recent maritime menace. The ensuing campaign was swift and decisive. In September of 1334, the combined forces achieved a significant victory in the Battle of Adramyttion. In a series of engagements, they crushed a fleet belonging to Yakshi, the Bey of Karasi. This wasn't merely a skirmish. It was a clear demonstration of collective power. The impact of this initial operation was immediate and profound. For a brief, precious period, the Holy League achieved a level of security in the Aegean that had been unprecedented in the 14th century. The Turkish threat, if not entirely eradicated, had been dealt a serious blow. Merchants could breathe a little easier, and the constant fear of raids began to recede. It was a tangible success, a testament to what could be achieved when diverse powers set aside their differences for a common cause. Yet, as is so often the case in the turbulent tapestry of history, this newfound security proved fleeting. The Aegean, for all its strategic importance, was not the sole stage for Europe's unfolding dramas. Just as the Holy League was savoring its victory, the rumblings of a much larger and ultimately more consuming conflict began to echo across the continent. The slow, agonizing escalation between England and France. This burgeoning conflict, soon to engulf Europe in what would become the 100 Years' War, pulled at the very fabric of the Holy League. Papal attention, which had been so instrumental in forging the alliance, was inevitably diverted. The French galleys, those powerful vessels funded by the Pope and integral to the League's strength, were recalled, their resources needed for the impending conflict closer to home. The grand plans for the reassembly of the League, the vision of a sustained, unified front, had to be scrapped. While some individual participants continued their efforts, achieving isolated victories against the Turks, the unified strength, the collective might that had brought such success at Adramyttion, was dissipated. The political maneuverings and strategic demands of Western Europe had, for the moment, eclipsed the pressing needs of the Eastern Mediterranean. It would not be until the papacy of Clement VI, almost a decade later, that a new Holy League would be formed, born from the same urgent necessity, but forged in the crucible of a different geopolitical landscape. The 1332 Holy League, though ultimately short-lived in its full strength, had shown what was possible. It had offered a tantalizing glimpse of a secure Aegean, a testament to the power of cooperation against a common foe. But it also served as a stark reminder of the fragile, interconnected nature of medieval politics, where even the most pressing regional threats could be overshadowed and undermined by the grander, often bloodier, machinations of European power. The brewing storm in the Aegean had finally gathered its thunder, and now it was time for the lightning to strike. After years of relentless Turkish raids, of merchants losing their livelihoods and their lives, of the very fabric of trade fraying at the edges, the scattered Christian powers of the Aegean Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean had, against all odds, forged an alliance. This was the Holy League of 1332, a desperate, yet determined, pact spearheaded by the formidable naval power of the Republic of Venice. But they were not alone. The formidable Knights Hospitaller, the Kingdom of Cyprus, and even the often troubled Byzantine Empire had joined their banners, with promises of support from other, lesser powers. This was not merely a convenience. It was a necessity born of shared fear and the dawning realization that no single entity could stand against the growing tide of Turkish aggression. Now, it's important to understand the context here. The early 14th century was a time of immense flux in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire, once a colossus, was a shadow of its former self, constantly battling internal strife and external threats. Venice, while powerful, was a mercantile republic, its strength derived from its vast network of trade. The Knights Hospitaller, a military order, possessed impressive martial prowess but finite resources. The Turkish Beyliks, on the other hand, were dynamic and rapidly expanding, fueled by a zealous new faith and a hunger for plunder. Their naval raids were not just isolated incidents. They were a systemic threat that gnawed at the very lifelines of Christian trade and sovereignty in the region. The idea of a united naval league, therefore, wasn't a sudden epiphany. It had been percolating for years. Individual treaties, often temporary and bilateral, had been a common feature of the Aegean. We see evidence of this in the years leading up to 1332, with agreements like the one between the Genoese and the Hospitallers before 1319. That particular alliance, in the summer of 1319, managed to crush a fleet belonging to the Aegeanids, a significant Turkish Beylik. The reports of this victory, mind you, were not confined to the immediate battlefields. They spread like wildfire through the West, reaching the ears of powerful figures like Pope John XXI. Imagine the ripple effect, a distant victory igniting hopes in the hallowed halls of the Vatican, suggesting that a unified naval league could not only impose an economic blockade, but also effectively check the relentless Turkish advance in the Aegean. Simultaneously, political pressures from other quarters were pushing the Venetians towards a more decisive stance. The Catalan Company, a notorious mercenary group, was exerting considerable influence in Greece, creating further instability. In response, Venice, ever pragmatic, issued a severe ban on its merchants trading with the Turks. The penalties for such commerce were heavy, reflecting the growing understanding that by engaging in trade, they were inadvertently strengthening their enemy. This wasn't merely a moral stand, it was a strategic imperative. The Venetians then dispatched emissaries. Imagine these envoys, meticulously dressed, navigating the treacherous political waters of the age, to the Byzantine Emperor Andronikos II, to Martino Zaccaria, the Lord of Chios, and to Elion de Villeneuve, the Grand Master of the Hospitallers. Their mission was clear: to explore the possibility of forming a societas, a true partnership, for the collective defense of their lands against the Turkish threat. The negotiations were complex, as you can imagine. Each power had its own interests, its own rivalries, its own historical grievances. But the shared danger was a powerful unifier. And so, on September 6, 1332, representatives from Venice, Byzantium, and the Hospitallers finally entered into an alliance. This was a 5-year pact, ambitious in its scope, and it laid out a concrete plan. A fleet of 20 fully equipped galleys was to be assembled in the bustling harbor of Negropont by April 15, 1333. A firm deadline, a clear objective. However, as is so often the case in history, even the best-laid plans can be waylaid by unforeseen circumstances. The agreed-upon date for the fleet's assembly came and went without the promised flotilla. Venetian attention, unfortunately, had been abruptly diverted by a revolt on Crete, a crucial outpost in their vast maritime empire. These were the realities of the 14th century, a constant juggling act of internal stability and external threats. But the momentum for the League, once established, was not easily quelled. Later that year, Pope John XXI, with his vision for a united Christian front, along with the kings of France and Cyprus, pledged their support. This was a crucial injection of political and financial backing. By early 1334, the participants had reached an agreement on a far more ambitious target, a total of 40 galleys. Think of the logistical undertaking required to build, man, and equip such a fleet in that era. In March of that year, a significant step forward was taken with the construction of 4 galleys in Marseille, powerful vessels with 176 to 180 oars, specifically on behalf of the Pope. He then appointed the French knight John of Sepoy as the captain of this Franco-Papal fleet, a signal of the papacy's serious commitment. And so, with renewed vigor and strengthened resolve, the Holy League was ready to unleash its hammer of Adramyttion. In the summer of 1334, the combined might of the Franco-Papal fleet finally joined with the ships of the Venetians, the Hospitallers, and the Cypriots. This brought the fleet to its full, agreed-upon strength, a truly formidable force sailing the azure waters of the Aegean. The only exception, the notable absence, was the Byzantine galleys, a telling sign of their continuing internal struggles. Nevertheless, this was the strongest Christian naval force the region had seen in decades. Their target was clear and ambitious. They aimed to strike at the very heart of the Turkish threat, attacking the Beyliks of Aden, Karasi, and Sarukin, the very entities whose incessant raids had spurred the League into existence. The moment of truth arrived in September of 1334. The forces of the Holy League achieved a truly remarkable success in the Battle of Adramyttion. Adramyttion, a port city on the Anatolian coast, became the stage for a series of decisive naval encounters where the Allied fleet utterly defeated a Turkish fleet belonging to Yakshi, the Karasid Bey. This was not a minor skirmish. It was a significant morale-boosting victory. Imagine the sight. The sleek galleys of the Holy League, their oars churning the water in unison, their banners snapping in the wind, clashing against the Turkish vessels. The cacophony of battle, the shouts of the oarsmen, the twang of bowstrings, the clang of steel, a symphony of medieval warfare played out on the open sea. The impact of this victory was immediate and profound. The League, in a relatively short span of time, achieved an unprecedented level of security in the Aegean. For the first time in the 14th century, the relentless Turkish naval threat was, for a period, significantly curtailed. Merchant ships could sail with a greater sense of safety, coastal communities could breathe a temporary sigh of relief, and the very idea of Christian unity, however fragile, seemed to be validated. The hammer of Adramyttion had indeed struck a powerful blow. However, as we often see in the grand tapestry of history, security, especially in such volatile times, is a fleeting commodity. Even as the Aegean enjoyed this brief respite, storm clouds were gathering over Europe itself. The slowly escalating conflict between England and France, a conflict that would soon erupt into the 100 Years' War, began to divert papal attention and, crucially, the French galleys that had been so vital to the Holy League's success. The grand plans for the reassembly of the League, for further sustained operations against the Turks, had to be scrapped. The shifting priorities of the great European powers meant that the unified strength of the Holy League simply could not be maintained. Though some of the individual participants of the League did continue to join their fleets and even achieved further isolated victories against the Turks, the collective, overwhelming force that had triumphed at Adramyttion was dispersed. It would not be until the papacy of Clement VI, almost a decade later in 1343, that a new league would once again be formed, attempting to rekindle the flame of collective action against the Turkish threat. The hammer of Adramyttion had delivered a powerful strike, but the forces it sought to contain were too vast and the attention of Europe too divided for this fleeting security to truly last. The Aegean, for all its temporary peace, would soon find itself once again amidst the brewing storm. The dust of victory had barely settled over Adramyttion. The Aegean, for a fleeting moment, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The coordinated might of the Holy League had delivered a decisive blow, reminding the Turkish Beyliks that Christian Europe, when united, was still a formidable force. Security, a concept largely unknown in the 14th century Eastern Mediterranean, had briefly taken root. It was a testament to what a grand alliance, forged from diverse interests but bound by a common threat, could achieve. But history, my friends, rarely tells a simple tale of triumph. Even the most carefully constructed alliances are fragile things, susceptible to the shifting sands of political ambition and the relentless tides of wider conflict. The success of the Holy League, impressive as it was, would prove to be a delicate bloom, wilting under the shadow of far-reaching European struggles. Remember, this alliance was a tapestry woven from many threads. The commercial imperatives of Venice, the crusading zeal of the Hospitallers, the struggling Byzantine Empire, and the distant, yet influential, hand of the papacy. Each participant had their own motivations, their own vulnerabilities, and their own entanglements in the intricate web of European power politics. And it was these entanglements that would ultimately unravel the fragile unity that had brought such a resounding victory at Adramyttion. The very success of the Holy League, in a strange twist of fate, allowed some of its key architects to turn their attention elsewhere. For the papacy, particularly under Pope John XXII, the Aegean campaign had been a significant undertaking, requiring considerable resources and diplomatic effort. But the Pope's vision extended far beyond the shores of Anatolia. The larger chessboard of Europe demanded his constant attention, and the burgeoning tensions between the two great powers of the West, England and France, were beginning to overshadow all other concerns. We're talking, of course, about the brewing storm that would soon erupt into the 100 Years' War. This monumental conflict, a generational struggle for dominance, would fundamentally reshape the political landscape of Europe for over a century. And as the clouds of this colossal war gathered, the distant whispers of Turkish raids in the Aegean began to sound less urgent to the ears of Western European monarchs and prelates. Consider the French galley, that vital contribution from a kingdom whose involvement had lent considerable weight to the League's naval strength. This single vessel represented a significant investment and a commitment of French resources. But as the prospect of war with England loomed larger, as disputes over succession and territorial claims flared, the notion of deploying precious naval assets to the eastern Mediterranean became increasingly untenable for the French crown. The immediate defense of their own borders, the projection of their own power in a conflict that threatened the very fabric of their kingdom, naturally took precedence. The Turkish threat, while still present, suddenly seemed a distant and secondary concern compared to the imminent dangers on their doorstep. The papacy, too, found its focus shifting. While the popes of this era continued to champion the idea of a crusade against the infidel, their political influence was constantly being tested by secular rulers. The 100 Years' War presented a new set of challenges and opportunities for papal diplomacy, often requiring careful navigation between warring Christian factions. Maintaining a powerful naval presence in the Aegean, coordinating disparate forces, and consistently funding such an endeavor became an increasingly difficult proposition when the very heart of Christendom was tearing itself apart. So, the grand plans for the reassembly of the League, the intention to build on the momentum of Adramyttion, began to falter. The collective will, so strong in the face of an immediate common enemy, began to dissipate as individual members were drawn into their own, more pressing struggles. It's a recurring theme in history, isn't it? The Grand Coalition, the unified front, often struggles to maintain its cohesion when the perceived urgency of the initial threat diminishes, or when new, more immediate dangers emerge closer to home. Some individual participants, of course, continued their own efforts. The Venetians, whose commercial interests were inextricably linked to the stability of the Aegean, and the Hospitallers, whose very existence was predicated on the struggle against non-Christian powers, still maintained fleets and engaged in skirmishes. They achieved some isolated victories against the Turks, demonstrating their enduring commitment. But these were localized efforts, lacking the coordinated strength and strategic vision of the full Holy League. The powerful synergy of a truly unified command was gone, replaced by fragmented actions and limited objectives. The period following the triumph at Adramyttion, therefore, becomes a fascinating study in the psychology of alliances. The initial euphoria of victory slowly gave way to the sobering realities of long-term commitment and the relentless demands of a wider geopolitical landscape. The security achieved in the Aegean, so hard-won, began to erode. The Turkish Beyliks, though chastened, were not eradicated. They would, in time, regroup and renew their pressure on Christian holdings, understanding that the unity they had faced was a temporary phenomenon. It would take nearly a decade, and a new pontiff, Clement VI, to resurrect the concept of a Holy League. By 1343, the situation in the Aegean would again become so dire that another coordinated effort was deemed essential. But the intervening years would be marked by a return to the precarious, fragmented state of affairs that had initially necessitated the League's formation. The lessons of Adramyttion, of what could be achieved through unity, would have to be learned anew. And so, we see that even the most successful military alliances are not immune to the gravitational pull of larger conflicts. The story of the Holy League of 1332, triumphant at Adramyttion, is also a story of how a grand alliance, born of necessity and achieving early success, can ultimately be consumed by the wider wars and shifting priorities of its powerful members. It is a subtle, yet powerful reminder that history is rarely a straight line, and even the most resounding victories can be fleeting if the underlying unity crumbles amidst the clamor of other, more pressing drums of war. And so, our journey through the treacherous waters of the 14th century concludes. The echoes of a fragile alliance, formed in desperation and dissolved by the winds of greater conflicts, remind us of the ever-present dance between cooperation and self-interest in the annals of time. If you found solace or intrigue in this narrative, please consider liking, sharing, and following for more deep dives into history's forgotten corners. What did you find most surprising about this Holy League, and what other overlooked chapters of the past would you like us to explore next?